Welcome, everyone. Happy Monday. Hope you're doing really well. I'm super excited to be here with you this evening. For those of you that are joining me live, if you could just let me know where you're joining me from, it'd be great to know, so you could put it in the chat itself. So this evening, I am going to be covering several areas as it relates to the psychology of project management. But before we do so, my name is Bernardo Tirado, and welcome to Career Insights, where we help career-driven professionals, I would say maximize, but it's really advance their career the smartest way possible. And if you are new to this channel, feel free to follow me in any of these stations over here. I mean, certain stations, but any of these social media networks here. But what I was hoping to be able to do today is kind of really walk you through four main areas as it relates to the Maximizing Project Success Through Human Performance. It's a book that I wrote about, well, I can't believe it's about 7 years ago, but it still applies today. And so what I wanted to do is kind of share with you a little bit more around what's the crux of the book itself, and then also answer any questions that are coming from you specifically regarding the content that we will be discussing today. And I see we have someone from Brooklyn, New York. Thank you for joining. And anyone else, I see a few viewers, if you can just let me know where you're joining me from so that I know. I'm here in New York as well, so we have a fellow New Yorker that's joining us. So let's get started. In regards to wrong person and wrong information. Give me 1 second. So why marry industrial psychology and project management? So I'm an industrial psychologist, and for those of you that don't know what that means, it means that I study people at work. And I became very interested in this particular topic when I started doing merger and acquisition work, where there was I would say, an interesting path of just trying to understand the dynamics of integration of teams from smaller companies into larger companies. And that's kind of where I got introduced into the whole world of project management. And one of the reasons why I married industrial psychology and project management is because when you're in the project management field, it doesn't really matter if you are just out of school or if you have 20, 30 years of experience. You're having to lead people. And many times you're leading people who don't want to be there, who don't want to help out, but they've either been volunteered to work with you or are basically it's an extra credit assignment. And so as a result of that, they're not always wanting to kind of help out when it comes to the objectives that you have. And in many instances, you're having to influence without authority. So that's one of the reasons why I started to focus on the whole aspect of marrying industrial psychology and project management. And what that led to was the creation of this particular book. And there are four main areas that I'm going to be covering. But before I get into that, the way I designed it was so that it could be a workbook where you're able to really take different sections and map out specific strategies as to how to manage stakeholders, how to network, even covering where to sit. So the power of the power seat, which is what I call it. And I'll get to that in a minute. But those pieces become extremely critical and important. So one thing that most project managers don't take advantage of is how are they specifically introduced when they are being brought into a particular team. So for instance, if I'm being brought on to lead a particular team, I usually ask my sponsor to introduce me to the team itself, to say, hi, we just have Bernardo Tirado, who is an expert in leading large-scale initiatives, who will come here and work with all of us to be able to make sure this project is successful. Again, I'm making up some of the context, but I've done this before. And the reason why I've always asked the project sponsor to do that introduction, whether it's via email or in a conference setting, or now obviously through Zoom, is because they are now setting the stage that they are buying into me as the project manager to execute and lead this team. So rather than just being assigned a project, you've now created an environment where the individuals that are going to be working with you know that you have the ear of that particular sponsor. So when we think about the whole aspect of project management and psychology, there's certain things that we leave at the table that this book particularly covers. So again, I'm going to stop in between sections to see if there are any specific questions, but let me start with the first section, which is really more about you. What do we do and what behaviors do we exhibit that either help or hurt us when we are specifically leading projects? So the first, as I just mentioned, is the whole introduction. The other is how you set the tone when you are specifically leading a project team. What I mean by that is if you start meetings at, let's say, 10 o'clock and you let people start, and I know this is a little bit of a different dynamic because at the end of the day, we're in a pandemic and we can't necessarily physically meet, but what I'm about to say does apply in this instance or in other instances. But how you set the meeting schedule becomes very important, because if you start the meeting at 10 o'clock and you let people trickle in at 10, 10:15, 10:20, then what you're saying is that the time that you have with this, the time that you have set apart is loose. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if they show up on time or not. This is why when you are actually kicking off the team itself and the team meeting, the first, I would say 4 or 5, until people get into a cadence as to, or a rhythm as to how you want to lead the particular meeting itself, you start on time. Whether or not people show up, you need to start on time. And that's also based on you. So if you're time bound, then you start on time. If you're not time bound, then you allow people coming in and out. The problem is if you're not time bound and you don't set boundaries up front, what then you lead into, and this I talk more into the book itself, is you lead then yourself into perhaps not being seen as a leader. Even though in the beginning I just talked about having your sponsor setting you up as the leader, they may wind up looking at you and saying, well, he can't lead because he can't basically control how the environment is set up. And control and dynamics in this context is not so much about dominance and submission. It's about how you set the stage from a leader perspective. And everything I'm specifically speaking about is only on the onset. It's not necessarily something that you want to do on a continuum, because at a certain point, it then becomes more like a dictatorship. And that's not what you want, because then people are not going to want to work with you. But it's the subliminal and unconscious type of behaviors that you want to be very careful and mindful of as to how to go about making sure that you set the stage for how you want the group to evolve. This leads you into group dynamics. And so how the group evolves is extremely important on the onset of when you're leading a particular team itself. And then as time goes by, you're going to wind up meeting people who are going to test your leadership, who are not going to want to follow you. And so these are things that I also cover in the book as to how to go about finding ways of getting people to want to work with you who don't want to specifically work with you. The other part of it as well is when you are managing projects, and this is why in the first part I talk about your behaviors that may help or hurt you, is around how you come across from a personality or personal perspective. Whenever you kick off a new team or you're going to launch a project, one of the first things that I specifically focus on is building relationships with the team members first, before I actually bring everybody together. The reason for that is, one is because you want to be able to build a personal and professional, or I say a good rapport with the individual, but also when you're having those conversations, you're able to start to understand what are the priorities that these individuals have on their plate, and also try to understand what's in it for them. What do they want out of this project? Why do they want to work with you? And if they are not getting anything out of you, then you already know you need to come up with a strategy as to how do you get them to want to work with you. Now, a part of it could be them liking you. Another part of it is longer term. Maybe they want to be able to move into another department or another area, but that's your job, is to find out some of these pieces up front to be able to then, when you bring everybody together, you've already built those interpersonal relationships with those individuals. The other part that I cover in the book as well is doing your research on the people that you're meeting. And what I mean by that, and that's either setting up your team, interviewing, or any of that sort, try to find out as much information as you can of the people that you're going to be working with. And when I say information, I mean, like, are they visual learners? Are they auditory? Do they like sports? Do they like fashion? What do they like? And also from a personal standpoint. And once you find that out, your next piece of your next thing that you need to do is to think about internally, from an authentic self perspective, what exactly is it that I have that could connect with that other individual? So if it's sports, if it's charity, whatever it is, something that specifically that you can connect. In one of the videos that I do on my YouTube channel, I spoke about, for example, I've done triathlons and trying to get back into that. So if I wanted to speak about running, I can talk to someone who's a runner and understand what tips can they provide to help increase my speed or increase my endurance. Again, it doesn't have to be exercise, but something that you like to do. I would never suggest, and I also talk about this in my book as well, I would never suggest that you be inauthentic. You have to find what is it about you that you like and you love to do, and find a common ground to be able to build that rapport itself. So that's kind of like the first piece, which is what you can do to help and hurt yourself. I'm going to take a pause for a second to see if there are any specific questions or comments that are, that you may have before I go into my next section. Are there any questions so far? And hopefully I'm not going too fast. And if I am, just let me know. It's the New Yorker in me. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to move on to the next section. And by the way, if the questions do come up after watching this, always feel free to reach out to me directly on Twitter or Instagram at Professor Tirado. I'm always accessible and being able to answer questions. But the second part of the book is really now about unconscious and conscious behaviors that compromise project success. So I kind of started talking a little bit about it when I mentioned about group dynamics. And it's something that doesn't always get looked at when you are leading a team itself. And so the first example I provided is where you're kind of leading a team right from the onset that you've never met, they've never met you before. But what if you're leading a team where the project is failing and you've come in to kind of triage the project itself? Or you're leading a team of people that really just don't want to be there. So here is where you're looking and trying to understand where in the evolution of group dynamics have they evolved into, and how do you come up with strategies then to have them want to, work with you? Like, how do you influence them? A couple of things that become very important is to understand who is the informal leader of the group. So when it comes to psychology, the psychology and evolution of groups, there's the formal leader and there's the informal leader. Sometimes they're the same person, sometimes they're not. The differences between the two are the following. A formal leader is basically the org chart. So this is my manager, I am his employee, or that this other person is their manager. That's the formal structure, a formal leader. But just because they're the boss doesn't mean that everyone listens to them. That's where informal leadership comes in. So the second part of the book itself is really focusing on how do you identify the informal leader of the group. 9 times out of 10, the way to be able to initially identify who is the informal leader is by looking around as to who is speaking up the most and who is actually listening to whom. That's one tell sign that there's an informal leader that's there. Or when you're kicking off meetings and you have someone that's constantly challenging you, there's a very big difference between someone who is naturally conservative, or some people may say negative, but conservative, who's coming up with other ways of being able to test what the theory or the hypothesis that you're trying to implement with the project, versus someone who's challenging you. It's the person that's challenging you that you want to think about and consider, is this person not seeing you as the leader of the project itself? So that's something that you want to be very careful and mindful of when it comes to the unconscious and consciousness of the evolution of the group itself. Any questions in regards to the team unconscious and conscious behaviors before I move any further? All right. Well, hopefully you're not sleeping. um, so the other one of the other things, this also, by the way, is one of the things I miss actually doing these things in person, because you don't always get the immediate feedback. But I know that there are a few of you watching. The other part also is the organizational behaviors that jeopardize your project. So in this part of the book, I'm actually talking about the entire ecosystem of the organization and why it's important to know what is specifically happening from a politics perspective. And so that's something that most project managers get lost in, because they have head down, they're doing the project, they're trying to execute, but they're not thinking in the larger context as to what is happening. So the example I can provide is, if your project sponsor is a senior person in an organization and they quit, or they're put into what people sometimes call a special project, which means they're out the door, then that means that your project will be 9 times out of 10 at risk. Unless it's something that's extremely critical to the organization, it will get questioned, especially if you have a new leader coming on board, because they're now going to revamp everything. This is why it's important to understand the group dynamics of the organization, and more importantly, the politics of the organization itself. The other thing also to consider is where there are rivalries in an organization. Now, depending on what size of company you work for, if it's massive organization, you may have more politics than a smaller. Doesn't mean that the politics are better or worse. It just means that you have lesser people to having to influence. But in a larger organization, you may wind up having leaders where there may be different conflicting views as to what you're looking to implement. And so this is why it's also important to understand, if your leader or that sponsor is actually leaves the organization or moves out of the organization, you may wind up having to recalibrate or actually drop the whole project itself. So understanding the overall behaviors and the organizational dynamics becomes extremely important when you're managing projects. Now, the quickest way to be able to assess that is when you're doing your stakeholder assessment, is understanding who the stakeholders are. But in addition to stakeholder assessment, you want to look at who are, I would say, the kind of the peripheral influencers of the initiative itself, to decide whether or not there are other relationships you need to build to better understand the success of the project. So I kind of focus on that as well, which is a whole list of questions that you need to answer, and that basically looks at the organization as a whole, but it also looks at what's happening outside of the organization, industry wide. Are there anything, or is there anything that's going to be affecting what you're specifically doing today? For instance, artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotics. So if you're implementing a new technology that you know can be easily replaced with starting to build, getting data scientists and building data models and different sort of starting to do machine learning within the organization, then 9 times out of 10, the project that you're working on may become obsolete within a year or two. And the benefits that you kind of pitched, or the benefits that was assigned to that return on investment, may not exactly come to fruition, because now it's going to be replaced with newer technology. So I kind of focus on what are the other things that you want to consider when you're looking at the entire behavior of the organization and also the environment itself. The last part is bringing everything together. So I kind of talked about the individual, the team, and then the organization. And all of those really are in harmony as to the success of your project and looking at human performance. So when you're looking to either mobilize a team, a high performance team, that was a topic that I think was a hot topic for quite some time. And then I think now it's everything is agile. But high performance teams are usually no more than 5 or 6 people. And a lot of the high performance teams that do exist are more focusing on triaging issues or projects that are out of control and need an additional set of hands to kind of bring it back in alignment. So when you're thinking about the entire aspect and ecosystem of the evolution of the project itself, it's what are you doing to help support or hurt your own way of leading the team itself? Then also looking at the entire organization, meaning your entire team and where it is in the evolution of the group dynamics aspect. And then the last part is the overall organization itself. So the part 4 kind of brings a whole case study and brings everything specifically together. As I said, the book was originally was going to write it more like a read, you just read through it, something like the tipping point. I'm not saying I'm my Malcolm Gladwell, but I was going to originally write it that way. But because of the fact that I found that there were a lot of tools that I found extremely helpful and useful, not only in my career, but best practices from the top project managers out there, I started to incorporate that into the book itself, making it more into a workbook. In fact, that's actually where I was able to design a whole course at the graduate level for the Zeklin School of Business at Baruch College. So the CUNY University here in New York. So kind of designed a whole course around that, really focusing on strategic project management. So the book itself, like I said before, has examples and also has templates in there that you'll find extremely useful as you're launching your project and delivering the results that you have been asked to deliver. So I'm going to stop now, see if there are any other questions. And if there aren't, let's see if there's any other questions. Let me take a look. No questions so far. So what I'm going to do next is give you a little bit of a bonus that's in the actual book itself as well. Is when you are looking to pick your specific team, one of the things that is extremely important to do is pick a team that are not all like-minded. It's important to find a diverse group. And when I say diversity, I'm talking about diversity in thought, meaning folks that will challenge, that will question, those folks that have different thought processes outside of what your focus and delivery is. One of the biggest mistakes that project managers do is really just focus let me rephrase that. It's important to manage scope and the boundaries of your delivery. The mistake part that I'm talking about is not so much that piece. It's not understanding the before and the after as it relates to what you're specific delivering. What are the dependencies? What are the downstream issues or changes from a process perspective that you may be impacting as a result of the project that you're launching? And that's one of the areas that are the blinders of project managers, is they're not looking at the entire totality. That's where the PMO really supposed to come in. PMOs, for the most part, only have a lifespan of 2 years at most. And usually the reason why PMOs get generated and created, and this is going back from research and also experience for the last 20 years, is because there isn't any control as it relates to reporting and consistency and standards as to what is being delivered from a project perspective. In fact, when it comes to delivery of projects, one of the biggest challenges that PMOs specifically have is that, let's just say you have 500 projects in the entire organization, making the number up. 9 times out of 10, if you're relying on self-reporting, most people are going to say green, and that's not accurate. It's impossible to have all 500 in the example I'm providing to be green. This is why it's important that if you are leading a PMO or if you are a project manager, that you help introduce a level of comfort and tolerance of red and ambers. And I would also say that red and ambers should not necessarily mean red and ambers. And what I mean by that is most people use red and ambers like red is like, okay, we have a problem right now and everything needs to be dropped and all hands on deck. If you get to that point, you have a bigger problem. You really need to be planning ahead. And so your ambers your reds should be a little bit more like a darker amber, and your amber should be a little bit of a darker green or something like that. I don't know if that makes specifically sense, but it does to me, and it's worked. What I mean by that is kind of reduce or be more conservative as to the measurement. The other thing also when you're talking about red, amber, and greens is that you should add additional dimensions as it relates to what that specifically means. Most people just assume that the whole project is either green or red or amber, but there are aspects of it. Bucket that into scope, bucket that into schedule, bucket that into cost. And then you kind of then assess whether or not something is actually going into, or even resources, actually, I think about that, going into a closer to a red or closer to an amber. And then the last part that I would also mention when it comes to looking at things from its totality in program management and governance is making sure that you have the same consistency as to how tools are actually being generated and used. One of the biggest issues that typically happen when you are running large-scale organizations from a PMO perspective is that you've built a level of bureaucracy and a lot of paperwork. So what you want to focus on is creating on one or two main artifacts, like a business requirements document if you're in technology, so a BRD. If you're using Agile, you're not using BRDs. That's more for waterfall. You're pretty much using you're using Scrum, and you're doing user stories. But let's just say that's one artifact. The other one is the project charter or some other document that allows you to better understand these different elements of what the project is going to deliver, and also what specifically is it that you need out of that document. Many times, project managers spend a lot of time building RACI matrix that they never use. I cannot tell you how many times people build RACI matrices and they're like, no one really reads it. So kind of rambling on, but the bonus part was in regards to even taking it further from a project manager to a PMO, there's a lot of other areas that I think this book will help those project managers, program managers, or even portfolio project managers to be able to lead effectively within their organization, and also keep in mind the psychology behind how projects are being managed. And then the one last other part, and I promise you I'll be quiet after this, and then we can see if there's any questions. Oh, there's a question saying, is there an ideal team size to manage that maximizes efficiency and not sacrifices results? So there is an ideal size. The ideal size is, the ideal size is 5 to 6 people in a team. Anything beyond, so no, the smallest size should be 3. The maximum should be 5 to 6. Yeah, if you have a larger team, then you want to break that up and create sub work streams underneath the project that you're delivering. The reason why you want the minimum of 3 is because if you only have 2 specific people and you don't have agreement, you have the third one to break that tie in decisioning or the direction you want to take. The reason why it's no more than 6, think about SWAT teams, and I mean actual SWAT teams, like military SWAT teams. They're not massive groups. They're specifically meant and designed to be efficient and also to be intimate as it relates to the delivery of what they're trying to get accomplished from a mission perspective. The same thing goes with project management. So thank you for that question. The last part that I was going to mention was the psychology of where to sit. Now, I realize this doesn't necessarily apply at this point, but when we go back to work, it does become very relevant. So when we think about the power seat, whether it's an oval desk, whether it's a square desk or a rectangular desk, you want to be very mindful as to where power sits and where you're seating and what could be helping or hurting you when you are specifically leading a particular discussion. So again, probably a little more towards whenever we get a vaccine and we're back into the office, but I will share that with you right now just in case so that you can remember this. So if you are in a conference room and the conference room is a rectangular table, and I'm only going to focus on this one, the book covers squares, circles, ovals, but there is a science behind that. But the rectangular one, for instance, when you are kicking off the first time and meeting with your team in person, your seating should be at the ends, either end of the table. Once you've started to actually manage the project itself for maybe like a couple of weeks in, you should be moving in towards the middle of that table. So right here. So think of this as a rectangle. The reason why. So when we talk about power dynamics, here is usually heads of the table, and depending on where or family upbringing, you may have both parents either on opposite ends, or typically you have one parent on one side and then adjacent to that parent is another parent. So you are already trained from a young age where power and dynamics exists related to parents. In addition to that, when you move into the middle seat, if you think about it, when you go to a wedding or when you look at any kind of religious type of paintings, you usually have, and I'll use the wedding or birthday, for instance, usually in the middle of the seat, or the middle of the table, are the most important person or persons related to that particular festivity. And then it slowly goes out where, like, towards the tail end, you don't want to be caught there, but you're at the end of it. But it goes to show where the power is. So there's a lot of conditioning based off of our own personal experiences as to where power sits. So that's also an area that the book specifically covers, which is where to specifically sit based on the type of table that you're sitting in. So those are the topics and the tips that I was going to share related to the book. I'm hoping that you find that specifically helpful. I don't see any additional questions, but if anything does come up, feel free to click here and follow me on Amazon Live. I'll be continuing to produce and also showcase other authors over the next few weeks. And if you haven't checked out, please check out my YouTube channel, where I also every Tuesday, I'm always dropping new videos as it relates to career advancement and psychology. And also feel free to reach out to me actually on TikTok, Instagram, and on Twitter at Professor Tirado. So thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'm glad that I had the chance to be able to share some insights related to the book. Please pick up the book, and hope you have a great holiday if you are in the US, and enjoy the rest of the week and enjoy the holidays overall. Take care. Have a great evening.